In today's video, we're going to be building a small ribbon gift box that is both decorative and functional. I think it's either a great gift on its own or a really nice surprise to include another gift into, and they're just a lot of fun to build. Now, I would consider this design to be somewhere between beginner and intermediate. It's more about, do you have the tools to cut out some of these shapes rather than any kind of intricate skills needed. So feel free to follow along, and I think you'll have not only a bit of fun here, but you'll be really happy with the results in the end. For this box, I'm going to be using sapele, and then it's curly maple, but honestly, you don't really get to see the figure with the ribbon. Any light wood is going to work. I wouldn't use any kind of expensive figured wood because it's so thin that you don't really get to see the curl or the figure on the face grain whatsoever, but this is the only light wood I have in my shop. So we're going to use that. We're going to come in, I'm going to show you the dimensions really quick. Now what you're looking at here is the box and then the middle center ribbon, which is our highest point on top. I am making this box a square. You can do a rectangle, you can do whatever. It's relatively small, 5.5 by 5.5. But what I want is the total height to also be 5.5, which means I'm going to do a 3-inch box, and then our middle ribbon on top will be 2.5, bringing the total to 5.5 inches. It looks really nice aesthetically to have those equal dimensions on all sides, but it's up to you. You can do a rectangle, you can do a gigantic ribbon, whatever you want to do, that's up to you. Now the wood I'm going to use is going to be just 3/4 of an inch. The lid style here will sit over the top of the miter joints, so you won't actually be able to see the thickness of the wood, but I wanted some heft for when it's sitting as more of a decoration. And while it is a box that opens up, it's mostly a decoration. So we can't actually see the thickness of the wood, which allows us to use thick wood, which sometimes doesn't look great on thin boxes or small boxes, but we're covering that up. Now the ribbon aesthetically is a bit of a choice. I didn't want it to be super wide. I wanted it to be kind of fitting in with what a normal ribbon would look like. That led me to a total width of a little over 3/4 of an inch, a little under 13/16. My planer gets a little sketchy at and under 1/4 of an inch, so I keep each of these a little over 1/4 of an inch. 2 maple, 1 sapele in the middle. I went with just 3 stripes. You can do whatever pattern you want. Now, we have to take into account our tallest point is going to be the center ribbon. So for me, that is 2 inches. However, we do need to rip some of our ribbon off of this. So account for extra ribbon. I make the ribbon about 3/16 of an inch thick. In total, I glue up about 21 inches of this for a box the size I am doing. That allows me to get a couple rips off of the top for all of the kind of flat ribbon, as well as enough for all the pieces that are vertical and some extra in case I screw up. So I highly suggest plan on making more ribbon than you're going to need, because if you screw up, it's really hard to go back and get exactly the same look out of this. We're going to do the ribbon glue up right away so that while it dries overnight, we can work on the box and it will be ready whenever we get the box done. Now my process here, again, I'm trying to keep all of this basic, and it was relatively time limited when I did this the first time. So I'm going to use my table saw for resawing, and I'm going to use my jointer, but it's not necessarily required, but I will need my planer here. My method is going to be, I'm starting out with something that's about 7/8 of an inch thick here. I'm going to joint and plane 2 faces. I'm going to resaw this down the middle so that I have 2 halves and 2 faces. The outside 2 faces are going to be nice and smooth for a glue surface. I'm then going to joint and plane down, but again, you don't have to do the jointing here. You can use a planer sled. The middle piece to its final thickness. So whatever that is going to be for you, for me, a little over 1/4 of an inch. Only now does the middle piece need to be its final thickness. I'm going to then take those 2 pieces with my outside flat faces, flip them around, and glue them onto this, making a sandwich. Once this is glued, then I will deal with the thickness of the outside pieces. There's no need to deal with it in the kind of early time while it's gluing. I'd rather just get it in there, gluing up, then deal with the thickness later. I will go back to the planer and bring down each side until they're about even. It doesn't have to be perfectly even thickness. They just need to look even. I hope that process makes sense. It's intended to cut out any kind of double steps to save time. So you'll see me do it here. And once we get this in the clamps, I'll come back and we'll do this box. Well, the ribbon is drawing, we're going to make the box itself. Now, this is a little different from a lot of the boxes I make. If you watch my channel, the lid is not going to slide out and the lid is not going to be set in a groove. The base will be set in a groove. It's going to be basic miters, but unlike 99% of all my boxes, this lid is actually going to sit on top and sink in. So if you're skipping around, don't think that like normal, I'm putting the top in a groove as well as the base. So I'm going to cut these down to 3 inches in height. I'm going to cut out 2 roughly 6-inch pieces. I like to cross cut my final length while I'm doing the miter in case I kind of screw up a little bit on the first cut. I can remove another cut before cutting it to final length if I get bad tear out or something like that. Before we glue this up, we have to do our base and inside sanding. If you want, you can skip that part. I like to use solid wood. That's totally up to you. Solid wood, plywood, whatever works best. I like to also sit my bases in a groove instead of just like gluing them to the bottom. I come up 3/32 of an inch, leaving a decent enough lip there that it's not going to be too frail. I then cut my groove. I cut my base down afterwards to make sure it fits the groove properly instead of trying to nail it ahead of time. I'm only going to go about 3/16 of an inch deep into this. It doesn't need to be particularly deep into here. I like to do tiny pieces on the router table, but there's no reason you can't do this on the table saw, and longer pieces or things I need to get done really fast, I do it on the table saw as well. If you are going to have a base that you are going to sand, pre-sand it to almost the last grit, second to last grit, and then cut your groove and fit that. If you cut your groove to unsanded wood and then sand it down a bunch, it can be really sloppy and loose. We aren't going to glue it in there, but we also don't want it just flopping around like crazy and making a ton of noise anytime you move the box. This is the fit we are looking for with our base. It can slide in there, it can move, especially on the end grain side. If you have a cup, you're using solid wood, make sure it can slide through on the end grain side. As in a cup will mean these two bottom sides can be lower and this middle part higher, or flip that around, and it will act like it's a thicker piece of wood. So make sure this can slide all the way through. Now, when we go to cut this down, if we're using solid wood, we want to leave some room for expansion. So we're going to mark out our exact ends here and here, and then we're going to subtract a 1/16 of an inch. On something this small, a 1/16 of an inch is going to be plenty of room for expansion and contraction. If you are using plywood, make sure it's not extremely twisted. When you go to glue the miters on relatively small things, if it's twisted, sometimes it can shift one side up and you won't really notice it until it's dried, and then you'll bring it over and your box will rock and you got to deal with that. So make sure you leave a little bit of room in there such that this can slide around, whether it is plywood or solid wood. With your base all cut down to size, we just have two things to do here, where you're going, if you wish to do any sanding on the inside, if you're going to be gluing the lid on, there's no real purpose. Just be careful when you're sanding. Don't take too much off of one side or one piece, or they won't glue together as nicely. Do any final sanding on this, and before you put the glue on, make sure it fits in there. Sometimes when you sand this and then you cut it down, actually it doesn't fit exactly the same because you removed more off of the edges and accidentally rounded it over. So one last check before you put the glue on. I have a whole video on gluing miters, so I'm not going to go through it extensively here. Essentially, we're going to paint on a solution that's anywhere from 1 part glue, 1 part water, to 3 parts glue, 1 part water. Onto the end grain, we're going to get it to soak in there so that our full strength glue, which we will apply immediately after it has soaked in, does not just disappear on us. Sometimes when you're going to glue miters, if you apply just normal glue and not enough of it, it'll sink right in and then your joint won't be very strong. Now, I am not going to spline this. I think it looks a little busy with the ribbon. I just want to say that now. So if you do want to spline it after it is dried, I would suggest splining it at that point before we do anything else so that you can get it all flush trimmed and everything like that. But I will not be doing that for this box. For this process, we're going to need our base, blue tape. We're going to need some sort of water-soluble glue, water, a paintbrush, and a mixing cup. We're going to mix the water and glue into somewhere between a 50-50 to a 1-to-3 ratio. Think milk or cream. We're going to mix that together. We're then going to paint that on there. We're going to let it soak in. After that, we will then paint on regular strength glue. We will insert our basin and then we are going to fold this up. Make sure to not spill glue on the sides. Here's what it's going to look like doing slightly over a 1-to-1 ratio, a little more water than the glue. Again, we are looking for somewhere between milk and a cream that you would pour into a coffee, for example. We're going to mix this up well, and then when we go to paint it on, you should see it soak in something like this. It should not be running all over the place. Paint on your regular strength glue, and you want to make sure you still see it on the surface when you actually go to close the box up. Make sure it doesn't all sink in. At this point, we are going to place our basin to the second piece and fold left to right, pulling the tape nice and taut, but do not just yank it over extremely hard. Use your fingers to line the two pieces up so they don't slip out. We can then apply a little more extra tape, but when you're going to apply that tape, do not yank extremely hard. Make sure those two pieces line up nicely or else it's going to rock a bunch back and forth. It's easy to get carried away with how hard you pull on the tape. You do not need it extremely hard. Let this dry for at least an hour before working on it next. Our lid plan is going to be relatively basic. We're going to start with a piece of wood, ideally something about 3/4 of an inch thick. That is the dimensions of the outside of our box. So for me, 5.5 by 5.5, a square. We're then going to take this, and the idea here is that we are going to remove sections from either side such that on all sides we are left with this little lip and this lower part in the middle. This will remain 3/4 of an inch. We want this right here to be about 1/16 of an inch, relatively thin. This part here then will be 11/16 if you are starting with a 3/4 of an inch of wood, and this will be on all four sides around. This middle part will sit inside of the box, snug but not tight. We need it to lift in and out. And so we're essentially just going to keep removing material from all four sides until we get that fit. Now to make our lid, we essentially have three options here. The first, and the ideal one in my opinion, router table. It's great for when you have tiny things, it leaves a flat bottom. What we're looking for here is the look of a present. When a present is wrapped, it has no seam line, it looks solid. So the reason we leave such a tiny lip and why we want the bottom of that lid flat, the kind of wraparound lip, is that it will sit down nicely and for the most part hide most of the gap. Using dark wood really helps with this too, but we'd like to hide it. So router is going to be the ideal, flat bottom, easy to work with small pieces. Number two option is going to be the table saw with a flat top grind blade. A piece this size, I would have no issue doing it on the table saw 5x5, totally fine. Not my first choice. I think it's easier to control at the router table, but no real concerns using something like that. And we would just continuously run this through until we've removed all that material. It will be pretty flat at the bottom. The flat top grind blade leaves each pass flat, but sometimes your wood or maybe your throat plate dips a little bit. You got to do a little bit of cleanup. Now the third option, what most people honestly are probably going to have to deal with, is a table saw blade that is an alternating tooth bevel, meaning every single tooth alternates in a point. Unfortunately, it leaves these little fang looking things, so it's not going to sit flat. And if you're trying to glue this, it's terrible for glue surface. Now you can either clean that up with another tool such as a chisel or a router plane or some other hand tool. You could even attempt it with sandpaper. It's going to take a while. Or we can use the top of the blade to make these little lateral skim passes that will allow us to remove a little bit at a time a relatively flat surface. You will still have to clean it up. I'll demonstrate here what that would look like, but I don't love that. It's not the most beginner move. You have to kind of be very steady and understand what you're doing, but I will show you that it involves some stop blocks. So in case your only option is the alternating tooth bevel at the table saw blade and you want it flat and you don't want a chisel or router plane or sandpaper, you can use that method. Now this is how I would set this up. I've got an alternating tooth bevel blade in here. I've got a stop block and I've got my just a piece of wood here. So I'm going to set the height. With the table saw, we can take the full pass at once. It has enough power. Set my height to whatever, and I will have marked out where my inside of the box is. We can always trim down an extra little slice of a blade width at the end, but we're going to do the most of it beginning. Now I'm not going to spend forever doing this, so we're just going to set it there. This is unusual in that I like to have my stop block on the right, because what we're going to end up doing is starting to the left, making a pass, 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 all the way over. Once we get over here, we are going to move this to the center of the blade on this back end, and we will start pushing this back and forth over and over and over again, moving this through. And it will cause the top of this blade to essentially become like a spinning chisel thing and remove most of that. You'll see this in action. I'll show you what it looks like before and then what it looks like after. It is important that you set this stop block though, or else you will probably push your way into the main part of your wood, which can cause kickback and it looks bad. So set a stop block on the right, which is unusual, trust me. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to make all of our initial passes here. We start from this outside edge and work our way until we hit the stop block. This is what it looks like when we get to the bottom. We have all of these little ridges, right? This is not going to sit flat and it's certainly not going to glue well. We've got to get rid of these. We got to make this flat. So here is how you do this. And again, this takes a little bit of practice and it's a little sketchy, but not as sketchy as it looks. We're going to start from the outside and we're going to work our way forward. When we engage with the top high point of this, we're going to begin moving this back and forth as we go through. You can feel it catch right there because I'm hitting it. And as you can see here, we've gotten rid of 90% of that. It's almost flat. A little bit of sandpaper or a little chisel is going to clean that up. That is much, much, much better and so close to being exactly where we want it. So that is how you do it. You got to move it back and forth over the very top point of that blade, and you will clean up most of that ATB mark. I want to make sure to say that when you're doing things and we're trying to make sure things fit well and don't have gaps, we want to eliminate as many variables as possible. One of those is going to be whether or not the top of this, which this lid is going to be sitting on as well as in, is flat. If you have it shifted out at all, no matter how many times you chisel away or something with that lid, and you've got the lid flat, it's not going to look flat. So make sure, if possible, you've got some sandpaper stuck down to a flat-ish surface. Swirl this around, get that nice and flat, and that way you'll know it's your lid that's not flat if there is a gap. If you have any gaps in your miters, you can either fill them now with some sawdust and glue, and if need be, rolling over a little bit with a screwdriver, or you can do it right before we glue the ribbon on when we will do the final sanding. It doesn't really matter now or then. Just make sure not to forget it before you put the ribbon on, because it will be very hard to do any kind of sanding once that is on there. Now, there's a decent chance, because we are woodworkers and not machinists, that this is not perfectly square for you, and that's okay. We're going to try to cut an exact dimension to our box, but there's a good chance, especially if you made a square, it's just not perfectly square, which means if you rotate the lid at all, it may not line up, or it just will kind of be hanging over, because we can usually get a single piece really nice and perfectly square using our tools. But pulling this together, gluing all of that can be slightly out. That's okay. You'll simply cut this out to fit the top of the box, not going in, but exactly the perimeter distance here. And then we are going to mark out a side that we want to match up so that we always know it's that way after we've got it fit. And when we're doing the final sand, we will sand everything flush so that it all sits nice and flush. But we will have those marks so that we know as long as we insert it this way, it will all fit nicely and look square. It's an easy way to get around boxes that aren't square. A little sandpaper just to kind of finesse it into looking square. Just one final reminder, we are taking away the equivalent to these sides from the edge plus a little more, probably plus a 30-second or so. If you were using this as a box, you need it to be able to come in and out. It can't be a perfect friction fit, or else it's going to be impossible to get out of there. If you are gluing it down, however, you could make this really tight and then have even more glue surface on the side. That's up to you, but if you want to use it as a box, it has to be able to be lifted from the top, and we have a somewhat delicate bow on there. We don't want to have to yank that thing up off of there. So start with equal amount to the sides here, plus a 30-second, see how it feels. Attempt to take it off from straight up and down and see what it feels like. I'm going to take this in multiple shallow, wide passes rather than multiple deeper, narrow passes. So that way I don't have to move the fence more than once. I just have to raise the bit. It doesn't matter how you do this, whether you take shallow passes with it fully extended or you take deeper ones, but you go up, 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 and then move the fence back. Either way is totally up to you. This is the idea we're going for here, leaving this middle square area or rectangle, whatever your shape is, to sit inside of there. Awesome. Now we have to be very, very careful when we are moving this fence, as any change in the fence will double that distance. So for me, this is too tight. I need to remove more. However, let's say you've determined you need to remove a 1/16 of an inch. Do not move your fence a 1/16 of an inch back. Only move it a 32nd of an inch. 2 30-seconds equals 1/16, because we will be taking a 30-second from this side and a 30-second from this side. If you take a 1/16 off by moving the fence a 1/16 back, you will actually take an 1/8 off. Whatever the change is, it's going to double for the opposing sides. So 1/16 of an inch fence change means an 1/8 of an inch of material taken away. Be very careful with that. If you need to use test pieces, by all means do it. This is the fit I'm looking for. It can go in there, and we've got just a little bit of side to side, back and front movement. I hope you can see that. That's enough to allow this to expand a little bit and come in and out. You can always go a little bit looser. We will talk later about options for how we place the ribbons. And one of them involves, I don't want to say pinning in place, but giving a perimeter that will hold this to an extent in place. And one of them does not involve that. So that's a choice for later, but it's better to be looser than to be tighter unless you're going to glue this in place somehow. At this point, you're just going to keep moving up until you leave just about a 1/16 of an inch or so left over. Be very careful on those final passes. You can easily ruin this if you dip it down into that. So if you're using a wide insert, be very careful. In the end, this is what we're looking for. This very thin reveal hides that end grain really well, and it still sits in there nicely. Again, this is solid wood. We want some of that movement here. Now, if you were going to glue it, I highly suggest, and you don't have to follow this advice, there are plenty of people who have stuck glue all the way around this, and it has held together for many, many years. But if you are a cautious person, I would only glue a portion of these two sides, whichever way your end grain is going to be facing. That will still allow it and place it dead center for this wood to expand and contract a tiny little bit. This is a relatively short piece. It's not going to expand and contract much, but it's also very thin on these edges here. So if you give it nothing, there is a chance, maybe a small one, but a chance it could crack. But if you're going to glue it now, then sand it so that everything ends up flush. For the rest of us, we will be sanding this now so that it's flush. So mark out which way goes which way, as it's very hard to sand perfectly. So we're likely not going to be left with a perfect square by the end of it. My sanding strategy for this is very basic. I've got MDF sandpaper glued to it. I've clamped the lid in place as it is a little loose so we can open the box, but I don't want it to move as I'm sanding. I want this to end up pretty much flush. I will be doing some of the higher grits by hand, and when you have to do it by hand, make sure you don't take any divots out, as we need to glue the ribbon on, and we need glue surface for that. We don't want it unable to make contact, so just be very careful. I'm going all the way up to quadruple-aught steel wool, so 150, 220, 4, 6 in quadruple-aught steel wool, 400, 600, as I want this like almost polished look. I'm doing an oil finish though, so that's partially why. If you want to spray it, only go up to whatever your finish requires. Do the final sanding now. Be very careful, especially on the lid. Do not divot it out. Once you've got the final sanding done here, it's time to do the ribbon. Be careful with this. We will have one last chance before we glue something on to double check and make sure that it's not nicked, but be careful with it. Now, for doing the ribbon, I assume you have some sort of blank like this, and we need to plan out, especially if yours is not particularly wide, how we cut out of this. We need immediately 4 of the flat pieces to go vertically and then 2 to go across. We'll be splitting one on the top, but just account for that amount of length of flat ribbon. Now, thickness wise, 3/16 to 1/4 of an inch. Anywhere in there, I think looks good on a box this size. It's got a little chunk to it. If it's a bigger box, I would even go a little thicker, 1/4 inch to 5/16 of an inch, something like that. Now, our middle piece, our tallest piece that we need to save room for here, is externally going to end up at about 2.5 inches. So make sure you save that amount. If yours is only, let's say, 2.5 inches tall, lop off a section here before you go ripping off the flat pieces. If you need to, draw each piece out so you can see where everything fits. I'm going to go get my hands on the one I finished so I can get a few little more measurements for you to help you out here, and so you can see all the pieces up close before we cut them out. Unfortunately, I don't have templates or anything that you can use to cut this out. I just did this all by eye, and then you can get a look and we'll cut these out. Begin cutting the ribbon, I want you to actually be able to look at the one I've finished that I'm copying that I really like, because there are some key things here that I had to work trial and error. There's one key change, and I'll reiterate this later, but the major change I want to point out now. Currently, I have the top ribbon sitting inside of the side ribbon. Now, what the advantage in here is it lines it up perfectly. When you have that top in there, it can't move at all. On the downside, it's very hard to lift off, and it can even get stuck if it expands too much. I'm going to change that because the one I'm building now is going to somebody else, and I can't expect them to remember that. I'm going to have these go over the top of these. Now that means it won't self-align every time, but it will mean you can always open and close it. I'll give you some rough dimensions so you can get an idea, and I'll point out a few design things that I think worked. The first is going to be for this middle shape right here. This is again about 2.5 inches tall. At the very widest point in the middle, it is about 1 5/16 of an inch wide. Now this is kind of like an egg shape a little bit here, but it has to be narrow at the bottom as it ends up sitting in between the 4 of them. All of these side ones roughly connect down here on the tips, forming a square in the middle, which this then has to sit in the middle of. That's a little tricky, and it took a lot of sanding, and you can't really see it, but on the inside of this here, on the middle piece, I had to really angle and remove material so that it could lay across and sit inside of the part here that swoops. That took a lot of trial and error. I ended up gluing these outside ones down first and then shaping this one to fit into the middle. Relative to these side ones here, I ended up noticing that having a relatively straight part in this back here instead of looping it down, I think looks pretty good. And also make sure when you pull this curve in here that again, you have room for a middle one. If this is too straight and up, you will have not enough room for a middle one that matches kind of the aesthetic thickness. Another thing I want to point out here on this ribbon, these sides here, I made sure to leave the bottom of this area flat so that I have glue surface back here where it's connecting the box, but then also right here. It's not a huge amount of glue surface, but I made sure it was flat so that I could have some extra glue surface right there. Dimension-wise for these side ones here, this flat part is about 3/4 of an inch, which ends up matching up. All of these are cut into a 45-degree angle to sit inside of these. And I'll be able to show you this along the way, but I want to just label all this now so that you know. So they all sit inside of an angle. And then I knew that this was going to intersect the very tip, which ends up being about 3/4 of an inch to come out. So that's a flat spot running through there so that this can have something to be glued onto. Then I curved it up. And then the total length of these are about 2 9/16 from the tip of cut to a 45 and out. You can of course change that. You could have them dripping over the side, whatever you want to do there. These from top to the bottom of where they're sitting are about 1 5/8 of an inch thick. And then the total length from the tip here to the widest part out back here is about 1 11/16 of an inch. So those are mostly the dimensions that I'm able to kind of give you roughly. I don't have it obviously in a way I can pull it apart, but I'll show you along the way as I remake them. If you want to look at my rough notes here, that's what they are with the rough dimensions. I know this is probably not the easiest to read because it's in my handwriting, but pause it if you need to, and you can see the rough dimensions right there. Now the order of operations for me, which I'm going to do again, was these top 2 first, and one of these you just cut in half so the other one runs through it because it's all hidden. The top 2 first, then I did all of the side ones while holding this in place, and it was easier to line it up when I was pinching them in. It's not going to be as easy when they're below, but that's what I did there. I did the top ones first, side ones, and then after that I did these ribbons that were laying on the bottom but curved here, then the 4 that wrap around, and then the middle one last. And that way I could ensure that it all fit inside of itself and it just kind of worked out nicely. I really like the idea of pinning this in there so it all stays lined up, but it's just very hard to open up, and I don't love the idea of yanking up on this over and over and over again if it's at all tight. So that's up to you, just be careful. At this point, you should have all of your flat ribbon strips cut out. We're going to grab the lid of the box. The first thing we are going to be doing is the cross on the top. This references everything else off of this. So when we do this, be very careful to try to line this up nicely in the middle and have it square. We're going to do one first that's going to be a single piece running down from end grain to end grain. We don't want to restrict wood movement here if we want this to be a box that lifts off. So the one solid piece will be from end grain to end grain running down the middle. After that, we're going to butt joint two pieces up against the side. This almost all gets covered anyways from the top, so it doesn't really matter that we're just butt jointing things up there. I use a mix of wood glue and super glue. This needs to dry faster if possible, or at least hold sooner, because we have a lot of little glue ups. There's like 10 or 12 little glue ups here over time to finish this bow. We don't want this to take 2 weeks. So if you are going over like I am and you are having the strip or the ribbon sit over the other ribbon top down, make sure to add in the thickness of your bow or your ribbon on the side ×2, one for each side. So for me, that's going to be 5.5 inches, the dimension of the lid, plus the thickness of each side of these. Quick rundown here. I marked out my 2 middle spots, lined this up using a square, held this down while I clamped this piece of pine on there. This is all double stick tape to this thing right here, which is clamped to the bench. I'm going to apply regular glue and super glue. I've got my 2 lines marked out that I need the overhang. Once I've got that down there, I'm going to do the 15-second hold for the super glue, then attempt to apply these clamps. Be very careful with your glue, at least on these outer parts here. We don't want it spilling over. Any spillover in the middle will get hidden and we can chisel it off without any huge concerns there. I'm going to let this sit for an hour. One suggestion I have is that if after you cut these thin strips, there's any kind of bow in it, place the bow, the hump side facing down so that when you clamp these down, it pulls it down. If you place it in the middle and it's a bow in the middle, it kind of facing up, you're going to have to apply weight somehow. So if possible, if you have a bow, clamp it so that it's pulling down from the outside. I will also say the other method of placing these on the outside hanging up and over is easier. It's just easier to align this with just a square and your fingers flush. This is a little more complicated, but it's going to be easier to open and close this way. As I'm applying my glue, I'm actually going to give this a minute to tack up so that it doesn't slip and slide when it is on there. That should make it easier for it to hold in place even with the super glue. We can hopefully get the tackiness of wood glue to hold it for us. Make sure it is not right on the edge or else it will squeeze out. All right, we're going to let that dry for an hour, hour and a half. We'll come back and we'll do the side pieces and just hope this is centered. Once you've got this main one glued on, we do the 2 halves on either side. Again, make sure you account for the overhang. It's better to have a little too much than not enough. We can always sand there. If we have to, we can sand down this as well, but it's just going to take longer. I'm not a big hand tool person. Anyone who's watched my videos knows that, but there's a reason I keep them around, because in certain cases like this, of very fine tuning the edge length of something small, it's a great way. Shooting board, just take a little off and have yourself right in there. We're now going to do the 4 vertical pieces, and I have just a few little tips here. Even though we are going underneath the top ribbon, we still will be pinching or containing this little lip of the lid inside. It's only that 1/16 of an inch, but it's still there. So when you cut this, I highly suggest a slight back bevel on just that little 1/16 of an inch at the top. It'll be hidden from the top by the ribbon, so you won't see it, but it'll make sure there's never any trapping of the lid for expansion. Now, when we glue the first 2 on, I like to work my way around instead of trying to do the 2 opposites. And the reason I like to do that is it's very important that we get this aligned correctly. It will destroy the illusion if one of them seems to be off to the side. It won't flow continuously. So make sure when you glue the first one on, you're holding the box so that the lid is not shifted. You line it up, you glue it on, then we go to the next side. And once we get that one aligned, that then will give us a reference to touch the lid of the box up against to while we glue the other 2 on. It just ensures that everything stays aligned. So we'll get these glued on, and then as they're drying, we can go ahead and make the bow tops themselves. It's time to cut out all of the bow pieces. Now, this is the one part where I wish I could give you more. You're going to have to just kind of look at these and do some hand drawing and erase and draw again and work on that. I don't know how to give you a template for these. It took me quite a few tries to stumble upon the shape I like. Now, there are 2 ways to do this. One that I'm going to do, which is going to involve a scroll saw and a bandsaw, and then the other way, which involves just the bandsaw and then some re-gluing of some things. If you want to do this with hand tools or anything like that, be my guest. That's totally up to you. So scroll saw way, very simple. Just going to drill a hole through, cut out the inside, go to the bandsaw, cut out the outside. However, the bandsaw only way takes one more step. So I'm going to bring you in here and kind of explain that. So the two methods I came up with, we've got one of my original attempts at drawing the shape, didn't like it, went much thicker here. I've got my template, which scroll saw, drill a hole through, insert the blade through, cut out the middle, cut out the rest with a bandsaw, done. And I've got, I'm fortunate enough to have this template here. However, the other option, before I kind of even remembered I had a scroll saw because I so rarely use it, was that I borrowed from the idea of a bandsaw box, which is essentially one entry cut into the middle, just a single kerf width, and then we cut out the inside very carefully, and we exit that same area. Now, in a lot of bandsaw boxes, people will just attempt to re-glue straight from there, and that's fine, except for the fact that we need this surface to be flat. It is our only glue surface to hold these on. So instead of doing that, on the first one I did testing, I cut a little sliver off of the top of this, inserted it in there and glued that in there. And then I kind of chiseled out to flatten it, and it worked really well. And it lined up and it looked great. I just then realized I had a scroll saw, and it's much easier to just go in a single shot and not have to worry about re-gluing these. So if you only have a bandsaw, take the idea from the bandsaw box of a single entry cut and make sure you come out the exact same place, and you will only have a little sliver that you need to glue together, and you will still be able to keep that nice flat glue surface for when we attach these. I whipped out the scroll saw from up in storage, and I just have a few comments here. The first, don't rip me apart for using the wrong blade or my technique being bad. I only use this once every 6 months. I got it from a neighbor, a great guy, and he offered me this. I had an old small Craftsman that used pin blades that I also got from somebody I know, and I moved that on for this. So I don't have a ton of experience. I'm not incredibly good at it. So don't rip me apart for that. It works very well at what it needs to do. I only use it infrequently, but it's perfect. And if you're asking why is this blower out of here, it's because it was stored in a garage for years and the little rubber ball that compresses disintegrated into dust, so it doesn't work. So that's why that's up and out of the way. Anyone watching this who has experience with scroll saws, let me know what kind of blade I should be using for this brand, tooth count. I believe this is a 5-inch pinless. It's just an old Delta. It feels like I have to push too hard. It feels like I shouldn't have to push as hard as I do. It still cuts really well, and it's surprisingly up and down, but it feels like I have to push really hard to get this thing to cut through this 3/4 of an inch hardwood. I'd love to know what the perfect blade to just go through that easily would be. And if this is not meant for doing that, that's fine. Just let me know that too, so I don't keep searching for some type of better blade for this. Currently, I just have an Olsen variety pack. They all seem really, really thin for this kind of work. My old Craftsman, there were some that were thicker, wider, whatever you want to call them, that were more aggressive and seemed more appropriate. So let me know. I'm going to go ahead and cut these out on the bandsaw. I want to leave meat on the bone, so I'm going to try to stay outside my lines. We will be sanding all of this down. There is one thing we need to make sure we do. Go ahead and make sure that these are at least 3/4 of an inch, these flat spots here. If you need to redraw the very bottoms, make sure you do that. We will be cutting out the wavy ribbon after we've done the cutting out of these so that we can match this flat spot to a flat spot on the wavy ribbon. And it's relatively important that they are all the same width and length. So be careful of when you do any side sanding not to take a bunch off of the other one. The illusion flows best when everything matches up. So just leave enough down here to glue. These are awkward to glue because they're actually back weighted. So you need enough to have enough glue on here that it can help hold itself down with some tackiness. When it comes to this middle one, you can go ahead and rough cut this out now, but almost all of the shaping, the final shaping of this gets done after these 4 have been glued down, as we need to shape this to fit in the middle. And it's another one of those where the tighter it fits, the more it flows, the better the illusion looks. So we don't want to do all of that shaping now, as we may make it too small or too thin and have to recut it later. But you can do the rough cutting of this now. At this point, we're going to do the sanding on the inside, really just the shaping. Don't beat yourself up too much if there's a few marks in there. Don't try to spend forever chasing perfection. There's only two places you can really see, and even then it's hard, and it's up in this kind of back area here and a little bit down in the front. We just want to keep a fluid shape going on here. We'll do the final sanding of the outside right before we get ready to glue them on there. We just want to have everything else done so that when we get to that point, we don't have to stop and go, ah, crap, I got to sit down and sand the insides. We just want it to flow nicely. At this point, we are going to make and attach the wavy ribbon pieces. And what I did originally and what we're doing here is I've drawn this out on a piece of pine so that we can visualize where everything is going to go. Inside of this square is our box lid. That is the dimensions I am using. The cross in the middle are going to be the pieces we have already glued on. And then these diagonals are going to be the positioning of the wavy ribbon. Now on the one I did earlier, I did not have it extend all the way to the edge. So this area here is going to not be part of it. And I've got the dimensions from my original one. We'll go over these, but this will help you visualize where everything is going to sit. I've added some double stick tape to the bottom. I want you to notice this square that is formed in the middle here. And then it looks more like a diamond from your angle. But these little guys sit on the diagonals and they line up with that center square. They're going to each line up touching each other like so, again, to continue the illusion as if it's all one piece. And the reason we leave the shaping until afterwards is because fitting this in there is a bit of a trial and error. Now, if we come in even closer here, you can see we have multiple spots and pieces of wood that are going to be the glue surface resting place for each of these pieces. So these wavy ribbons need to have a flat spot at the end here that aligns with the same thickness as the rest of our pieces. Each of them will have an angle cut in and they will sit inside like so. Now, because of this, we can see that we have a certain area that needs to be flat into here. And that flat spot, at a minimum, will need to cover the distance from the end of this little point to where this ends, as that will be our glue surface. Now, with these exact dimensions, you're looking at a little bit over 3/4 of an inch, but I highly suggest extending that a little more to like 7/8 or even an inch, and before you fully start raising your hump in the middle, as you will want to have room to clear the back of this. And you'll be able to see all of this as I cut it out and go along, but I want to have this all planned out in the meantime. So that will be, you will have your flat space right in this area. We will then have our up and down, and the height is up to you. I went about 1/2 inch at the peak of the hump in the wave, and then I come back down here, and then it's about another 7/16 to 1/2 inch where I curve up again into that little split end tail. So those are the rough dimensions, and that is how all of this lines up. And of course, once this guy is on here, and we've got all of this glued on, we will do all of our fitting and shaping into the middle. Now, in the end, this one goes actually like so. It faces with the cross pieces that are already cut into here like so. So you can see why there's a lot of shaping that has to be done to these 4 corners to get it to slide in there and to actually sit flat. Rough dimensions from my original one, it was hard to measure with the bows over the top, but roughly 2 5/8 total length. Roughly 1 to 1 1/16 of an inch of flat, 1 to 1 1/16 of an inch of the hump, and then 7/16 to 1/2 inch of the wavy tail that comes up with a height of somewhere between 7/16 and 1/2 inch to the peak of the bow. Now, I highly suggest doing some test pieces. Just grab some scrap wood and check the shape. And we want to also continue that same thickness roughly throughout there, as it will just flow better if everything looks the same thickness. So let's get to that. So the way I'm going to do this is to just take a scrap piece and transfer that height on there, as I know that will match, and there will be a little bit of sanding done to this to get the exact match, but that's my first one. I'm going to then take this and I'm going to mark out roughly 2 5/8. That's going to be where the ribbon ends. So those are my boundary lines, essentially. This is a little bit over a 1/2 inch. I just ripped this on the bandsaw, but make sure you've got a nice clean table saw rip or jointed rip on the bottom for the glue surface. This flat area also allows me to see the thickness I will need to continue throughout. I'll make a mark, let's just call it a little over 1 inch. That is going to be my flat area. And then we're going to come over from the end here, and we're going to mark out about 7/16 of an inch. And that is going to be where we transition going up in the waviness. So this middle area right here is going to be where our ribbon humps up. I also like to leave a little bit of flat area in here as glue surface, even if it's just like a 1/4 inch where this touches back down and then cuts up again. I want a little bit of flat spot there so that we have glue surface here and glue surface out here. Now, because I know this is going to be flat, I'm also going to roughly match the height of this where it comes down to the same thickness as our original piece here to give me a rough guideline of how thick to make this. So I've now transferred that hump roughly, and this will all get shaped. I'm going to then make sure I carry this area flat, and then we're going to come right back up into this ribbon tail, and then we're going to feather it down. So it's going to end up looking like that, and we will be leaving this flat spot. That's going to remain, and this whole part through is going to follow. Now you can extend this, you can shorten it, you can do whatever you want to it, but those are the 3 main sections here. The little tail at the end, the middle hump, and the flat spot. You're going to also want to carry over your lines. As you know, this at the end here, will be where this gets cut off. You will know that this right here will be your flat spot. You know that this right here will be where your pivot points up. And then I ended up doing the splitting of this tail after I had it all cut out, but it will look something like this in the end here. It will come down however you wish. And then of course over here on this end, we will have our little splitting to fit inside those lines. So it'll look something like that. The easiest way to determine where that is going to go is going to be to hold your piece up to here and then mark out where it intersects with the side, because I don't know exactly what thickness ribbon you have, but that's the easiest way to find that. And you will make a mark on the end. Just make sure that this is held up right to the corner right there. For my dimensions, this is a little over a 1/2 inch that ends up marking this out. And I just cut this out on the bandsaw. I didn't bother to take it and make that angle perfect, as it is all hidden underneath in the end. And we just need it to be the same height so that we have that flat glue surface and to look like it flows from inside of there. Once you got what you think is a pretty good rough shape cut out, I would highly suggest sanding it first before you cut into the tip here, and then before you do the angle here. It's just much easier to hold and not break. It gets a little fragile once you start cutting into those. Once you've got one that you think is done and that you're really happy with, bring it over to your actual lid for the final check. I need to remove some thickness from all of this. It's too chunky. This is a little too high. We really need this area to be the same level as these two so that when this all sits on there, it has an even amount of glue surface. That is arguably the most important thing here in terms of thickness. It's a little too chunky compared to what all of my ribbon is, so I've got some material to remove there. This angle here doesn't need to be perfect. It all gets hidden. You just want it to slide in there such that the two outer areas make contact. You don't want a gap like that. As long as that closes, it doesn't particularly matter if that is perfectly closed or not. Once you're happy with it, make a template out of it of some other piece of scrap wood, and then go ahead and make 3 more, and then we'll glue these on there. Right before we glue these wavy ribbons on, we have 2 things we need to do. The first is any touch-up sanding on areas that are going to be seen but will be very hard to reach. Do that now. I also suggest putting a kind of flowing round over onto the tops of these. It looks really nice when it just kind of flows and comes around. And if any of these are overhanging and need to flush them up, do that now. This gets harder to hold when it's got the wavy ribbon sitting on top. So anything now, a decent little round over looks really nice here, just flowing through. Once you feel confident that everything is ready, we'll just go ahead and glue these on. I'm doing a mix of wood glue and super glue here. They're obviously near impossible to clamp on there. Don't forget, we've left a little bit of flat spot here for glue, so make sure you put some there as well. Try to avoid too much and spill out, but otherwise, just press and hold. I really like the super glue here to get that kind of quick clamping power. But if it's just wood glue, that's fine too. Just let it tack a little bit so that it doesn't slip around when you're putting it into position. And just make sure to look and try to line it up with that corner right there too. I didn't cut these angles perfectly, so I got to kind of make sure they line up a little bit. They don't just perfectly slot in there. However you want to do it, let's get those glued on. The time has come for a relatively tricky part, and that is gluing the 4 of these on here. Now, one thing I highly suggest is get yourself some double stick tape. It is much easier to align all of these first with double stick tape and then go through one at a time and glue them on while the other 3 are set in place so that you know exactly where it's going. I also highly suggest a double gluing method here. We're going to have wood glue and super glue. These are back weighted. You'll probably have found that out. They will not sit up on their own. There has to be something to hold them while the wood glue dries, and good luck clamping that. If you are not in a rush, it actually works out pretty well to glue one of them, let it dry for even an hour, then come back and do the next one, and then the next one, and the next one. I mean, it's like a 4-hour process, but it really ensures that if you're doing one and you were to kind of bump the other one a little bit, it's not going to go flying off when it's moist. If you don't have to rush, don't rush this part. We want to get this right. I'm going to bring you over the top so you can see the exact alignment, as the alignment is important for then shaping this middle piece, which will then sit inside of there. It's really key that we get this aligned nicely now for the illusion and for the placement of this middle piece. So as we can see coming down from the top with our demo earlier being the same, we end up with this rough square diamond in the middle that this eventually sits down into after a lot of shaping. But what we're looking for here is to first have them line up with the ribbon in the back, to then have them as close as we can, touching on the side so that it all appears like it's one closed area. And then that leaves ideally somewhat of a square in the middle. Obviously, after sanding, these are probably not identical in thickness. You can see one of them is slightly off there for me. But if we get them all close enough, once we shape this and put this in the middle, it will all come together really nicely. So I'm going to go through, do one, wait an hour, come back, do the next one. And I highly suggest, like I said, double stick tape and get them in exact alignment first so that when you apply the glue, you can just slot one in there. All right, let's do this. I don't like this part. I never like the part where there's no going back. It's my least favorite part of every project. Remember to let this tack. It's really going to help if it tacks up a bit. All right, here goes nothing. That is in line with that ribbon. It's pushed in, touching. This one I moved a little bit, so that'll come back in. I'm gonna let that sit for a half hour, if not an hour, and then we'll come back to it and do the next one and work our way around. Been about an hour. The first one should have set nicely. I'm going to do the second one. Take this opportunity to look from the top and make any adjustments if needed. Maybe you bumped one of them some that's still just taped on there. Do the adjustments now so that when you glue the next one on, the others will then be locked into where they have to be. We're coming up on the home stretch here. We have to now make the middle one. This is the second one for me. I goofed on the first one. I wasn't happy with the look, but I'm going to show you up front kind of what it's going to look like so you get an idea going in. I didn't finish it, but I made enough progress on it before I decided it was cooked that it's a good example of what we're going for here. Now, it's going to help if you have, well, some sort of powered sander or chisels or carving knife or anything, as we have our kind of rough blank here, but we have to remove a fair bit of material, and I'll show you that up close so you see what I mean. But we essentially have a problem of a square peg has to fit into a diamond hole, and it's a lot of material removal to bring it on down and get it in there. So let's come in closer here, take a look, and you'll see roughly how I approach this. So we're going to familiarize ourselves again with the idea here. We've got these 4 ribbons that go outwards at angles, and then we've got the middle cross here. This is the one I started, didn't like it, ends up sitting like this. So it has to fit into this diamond shape here, which is awkward. This ended up just being too thin. So I've started with a big beefy chunk here so I don't screw up. But we end up having to remove a lot of material, angling these down to the side so that we end up with sort of an octagonal shape, a stop sign, however you get it down there, so that it slides into here. It just gently touches the insides of these ribbons, but we get that glue surface. That is essentially the outside shape of this is close to what I'm looking for. It's just the inside is just too thin. It doesn't match the rest of this. And of course, the rest of this will get rounded over and sanded to completion, but material removal wise, this is what we're doing. We're removing a big chunk. It's starting out roughly something square, going down into this octagonal shape at the bottom. Now I've got the inside shaped roughly what I want, but I always leave just a tad on there in case I kind of outside shape it a little off and then I have to correct inside. But close enough, we want the inside mostly done here so that we know our thickness. Now we've got this little swoop up, which is kind of an inside curve, and then a outside curve all the way around. But the main thing here is when it comes to doing these corners, and I know most of you will not have a spindle sander or powered sander of some sort, so chisel can absolutely do this. I end up just kind of freehand holding this and just wiping it up against this. I don't know if that's the right term, but and then just kind of going my way around like so to take that off of there. But if you have a vise that you could stick this in, you could certainly easily just chisel this off as well. I just find it easier to go a little bit at a time with a sander. So I'll show you a few clips of me doing this, but for the most part, this is going to be tool dependent upon what you have. But again, this is the shape roughly we're looking to get down towards so it can slide in there. You can see as material begins to be removed, we slide further and further down. This will just have to keep being removed until we get all the way down there. Relative to the one that's too thin, you can see there's still quite a ways to go until it slides down and in there. I've got the raw fit that I'm looking for now. So now it's just a process of smoothing all this out, rounding this over, making this the same kind of look as these other ones. But once you've got that base that it sits down there nicely, it's just aesthetically making this flow a little better. And then we'll glue that on there and we're essentially done before the finish. Well, I'm finally happy enough with where I've got it. So I'm just going to send it, just glue it on there. I'm going to give this fully overnight to dry because there is not a ton of glue surface And even though I personally wouldn't lift it from the middle, I know somebody eventually will. So I want to make sure this is really adhered onto there. There's 9 inches of snow outside right now. I hope everybody's doing okay through the winter storm, the winter apocalypse. So let's put this on there. We'll come back tomorrow then, and we will put the finish on and see how it looks. Also, I do want to note that it's always a good time to check whether this is able to be lifted off if you want. If it is too tight, you're going to have to sand either under here or on the back sides of these. I had to do a little bit of sanding there because if somebody is going to lift it and it's too tight, they could, yank too hard and tear one of these bows off. One more time, make sure this is in line with the straight ribbons, let it tack up, and then just give it a go. All right, well, we'll let this sit overnight, see how it looks tomorrow. If you've reached this far, congratulations, your box is now complete in terms of the build. I'm going to use just a boiled linseed oil finish. It's a bit of an awkward one. I use a paintbrush to get in there. You could lacquer this or any kind of thing, but you're going to have to at least paint some of it on there. It's just going to be really hard to get any kind of spray inside of there. But I think oil finishes are the easy, basic one here. Before you do that, just take one last kind of look around in some light to make sure there's no obvious scratches. And if there are and you could reach them, try to get those out ahead of time. I also suggest if you haven't opened this in a while, checking to see if it does open. If it doesn't, you're going to need to target that little lip with some sandpaper right where these overlay and match, as that's where it's going to be pinching if it's pinching anywhere. And so just make sure it does that now before you oil it, and then you'll have to sand and go back and re-oil. It's just a total mess. All right, let's put some oil on this and then we'll see how it looks at the end. As always, right before you apply the finish, make sure to sign your work and put the year on there. Whether down the road you look at it and want to know how old it is, or somebody else finds it and they're interested in knowing who made it and how old it is, make sure that's on there. Be proud of your work. Well, that's going to do it for this build. I hope you enjoyed the process along and that your result came out as nice as mine did. I'm extremely happy with this. As always, there's so much variation you could do to this, and feel free to let me know if you made any changes or did anything differently. Thanks for joining me today. Best of luck out there. Bye.